Happy St. Patrick's Day and welcome to Story Hour. I'm Kathy Ramsperger. I'm a lifelong journalist, humanitarian, and author of two award-winning novels. I'm also a coach who founded Ground One and Step Into Your Story. I'm here to connect people, both readers and writers who love books. I concentrate mainly on transformational stories of social justice that focus on the connections and often disconnections between people all over the world. Janet Oakley is my author guest today, and we'll be discussing the Quisling Factor, her sequel, but standalone book to the Jostling Affair. Jostling Affair is about World War II, and the Quisling Factor is about its aftermath. Both take place in Norway. It's an incredibly timely interview, and I welcome you, Janet, and thank you so much for being here with us.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really looking forward to this because it's a subject that I think has really been growing on me for the last 28 years, really. That's how long I've been at it.
Things find us, and they once they do, if there's a reason for them to stay, they stick around. So I want to tell you all a little bit more about the Quisling Factor and a little bit more about Janet, and then we'll launch into questions. Treason, espionage, revenge. In the aftermath of World War II, ex-intelligence agent Tora Haugland tries to adjust to life in his newly freed country with the woman he loves, but he still has to testify against a Norwegian traitor, one of the monsters of the German occupation, whom he helped to capture. When mysterious notes threaten Haugland and his family, he must choose between protecting them or bringing to justice the man who tortured him and destroyed the village that hid him. Challenged by injuries and recurring nightmares, he will have to rely on his former training and old resistance friends to rescue his wife from the traitor who will do anything to keep Haugland from testifying. And a little bit about Janet, who writes under the byline JL Oakley, O-A-K-L-E-Y. Janet wrote her first historical fiction story in 5th grade and hasn't stopped. Her fiction spans the mid-19th century to World War II. All her strong protagonists stand up for something, and I would say play a part in changing history. Her writing has received many awards, including a 2013 Bellingham Mayor's Arts Award, the 2013 Chanticleer Grand Prize, the 2014 First Place Chaucer Award, and Everybody Reads in Bellingham Read Pick, the 2015 Willa Silver Award, which is for Willa Cather, and was a Pulpwood Queen Book Club 2016 backlist pick in February of 2016. And now she's being recognized by Writer's Digest. Congratulations, Janet.
Thank you. You know how it is. It's so wonderful when your hard work is acknowledged, not just by the readers, but you also like that little spice that comes in from, the professionals. So Reader's Digest, Writer's Digest was really a real thrill.
It's a really big award because there's so much competition there.
I know.
And the other awards are incredibly, they're known, right? They're known.
The Willa Award, especially. Yeah. I'm very proud of that, to have been a finalist twice. They only have winners and 2 finalists. So both 2 novels set in the Northwest received that.
I mean, it's well deserved. So, so when you're not writing you're demonstrating 19th century folkways in schools and the national park on San Juan Island, and you're like me, have a cat who thinks that she's editing, and my cat, I wish my cat would edit for me sometimes, those revisions, So let's get to the questions. got a lot to talk about this really timely novel. Even though it's about World War II, it's so timely right now. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about the prequel to this novel, The Jostling Affair.
Yeah,
Just a little elevator pitch. So,
a little
because
bit.
the books work together,
Yeah.
and there it is.
So it's and they I called it jostling for 25 years, so don't worry about it. It's pronounced using. When you have
Using.
you get "oo."
And did I get his last name right? I know I got Tor
Conlon is
right because I worked with a Tor. It is okay.
Yeah, I threw it, and I always did it wrong too, but I'm getting much clearer. Yeah, so really it's set in central Norway. It's in the last 12 months of the year. And my hero, and we'll talk about hero later, but he is a British trained Norwegian who is working as an intelligence officer, but he's posing as a deaf mute. And he's working in this fishing village with someone else who knows his whole story. And then he works with fishermen, and they're bringing in arms and agents from the Shetland Islands. The Shetland bus was one of the most important parts of the Norwegian resistance, and actually to the Allied effort to keep the Germans busy in Norway while they're trying to fight the Germans on the continent. So that's part of the story. And then he gets sort of in trouble because he falls for this lonely woman who's accused of betraying her husband, and they see her as a German. She's really American. And we can talk about that, how they were treated later, and it's a risk, and he can blow everything. Because number one, if he blows his cover for speaking, I think it's the book of my heart. I think the other one is Mischievous, which is set of, prior 19th century here in the Salmon Islands. But I think it is my book of the heart because I fell in love with Thora. And, for women writing about a male hero, sometimes that's easy. It was harder to write about Anna.
I totally agree.
And
Totally agree. It's
and,
easier for me to write about men too.
Yeah, because I think we have this ideal. Men are not perfect, of course, and everybody has their flaws. But you always have this idea, and he's handsome and he's caring. He definitely has this compassion for people with hearing impaired problems. So that's the storyline. And of course, he does get found out. Now, the real person in the story is Henry Oliver Wren. And he was barely 5 feet tall. He was Norwegian, and he ran a notorious group called the Rinneganen. And they destroyed so many people. They captured over 1,000 British and Norwegian agents. A lot of them died in Trondheim. And he was awful. He was actually, Quisling was the name for traitor, and we'll talk about that a bit too. But Renan was the number 2 war criminal in Norway. So focusing on Quisling, the Quisling factor, who is a Quisling, who is a traitor, is sort of the background theme running through the Quisling factor. And this is a very important trial. It was so important they had international people attending it because it's sensational. Someone who is so brutal and ruthless. It hits the headlines, especially after World War II. So that's how the two go together. And it's dealing with trauma. And, I read a lot of wonderful memoirs in the early stages of research who had been agents or worked with Linga Company, which was a sabotage group supported by the UK. Some of them ended up with alcoholism. Some of them ended up, with real trauma. And he has trauma because of what happened to him. And also the trauma of feeling so badly for what happened to the village that protected him. They were innocent people, and they were destroyed by the Germans and by Renan. Renan's behind that. So,
thank you for the history and the backstory of the history in terms of what happens in your narratives. And I think that people don't write as much about the aftermath of the war. And that's what I loved the most about this book, because it was trying to get back to normal, but not being able to. And it was heartrending. So thank you for that. So I know you write in about a few different settings, and I'm wondering what came first. Was it the northwest of the United States, or was it Norway? And did you always know you write mysteries and thrillers? Did you always have a love for those?
Yeah. Well, actually, The Quisling Affair is my first novel. I learned to write a novel with that. And I tell people I had a dream about the man in the snow with German soldiers standing around him. And I told a friend of mine who had been an editor in her past life, and she said, oh, you should write it down. So I wrote down the prologue, which has not changed except for eliminating a few pages. And then she said, oh, this is great. Why don't you write a novel? Well, the thing is that I think I was influenced because I was a student in France. I was there in 66, 67. First of all, in Vichy, France, which was notorious during World War II. And then later on, we went down to Clermont-Ferrand, which is an industrial city, and that's where I went to university. And I remember being in Vichy. We were there 7 weeks perfecting our French because all our classes were going to be in French. And it's like being just thrown in, even though I had, 3 years of, well, I had 2 years of college because this is my junior year when I
Not
went
the same thing,
to high
though.
school. So, but anyway, but I was so intrigued by this plaque that was in Vichy in the square, dedicated to 25 students who were shot by the Gestapo. And I think that has been in the back of my head all these years. I had that dream. I decided to write about that. And so that was my first novel. I did not publish it for almost 25 years later. I pitched it, it won finalist things, and I could not get any company to purchase it and make it, and even an agent to get it published. So I published that really literally about, I think 6 years ago I published it. So from there I went on to the Pacific Northwest. And I had to write a paper for our local university. I was getting my master's in education because I've done museum work. It's really what the thing I've done in my background in history. But I had to write a paper. And my mom always told me these stories about the CC boys from New Jersey that showed up in Idaho, north of Boise, where her uncle had a ranch. And I always heard about these Jersey boys. And so I thought, I wonder if they have a Civilian Conservation Corps story here in Whatcom County. So I'm just below the BC border. I have over a 10,000 foot white mountain to the east of me. It's magnificent. It's white as all get out right now because we probably have 100 inches of snow that just fell. We have the highest volume of snow in the United States. It's gorgeous. And by golly, they had Camp Glacier. So that got me going on to the Northwest and leaving Norway behind. I wrote another one called Timber Rose, which is about the early mountaineering clubs, but largely run by women. They were like half of them were women. And they hiked these mountains out here, Mount Rainier, Mount Baker, in skirts, 1907. So I started doing that. And then I wandered off to the Civil War. That actually placed third in the Pacific Northwest Writers Conference. It's incomplete, but it's based on my great-grandfather, who was an assistant surgeon at the Battle of Gettysburg. That's another family story that has run through my family all these years. And I brought him out west because there's a lot of intrigue here in the Pacific Northwest concerning the Confederates and the Unionists in this. We were a territory back then. And then I just sort of finally decided, I pitched it one more time, Quisling, and that was it. The person said, we liked it, and I said, that's it. This is the book of my heart. I'm going to publish it, which I did.
I'm so glad you did. A lot of times a book of the heart is the last thing to get published, but it has the most profound impact.
Right.
The readers can tell it's from your heart.
Yeah, I didn't intend to be writing thrillers, for Pete's sakes, and mysteries. I think I was bordering on suspense. They call Mischievous, which is set in 1860 out in San Juan Islands. They said that's romantic suspense, and maybe even Timber Rose is, because I always have a love interest. I don't write romance. I don't consider myself a romance writer, but I write. There's a lot
historical novels with a love story.
Yeah,
that's what I do too.
Yeah. It can be at all levels. And then I also
there's a huge difference. It's not it's not romance genre. It's
You know, I have
literature.
I have these funny little ones too that are, I call them funny, but they're little cozy mysteries set in Hilo, Hawaii. So I got invited from a friend of mine who writes wonderful mysteries set in Hawaii and on the Big Island. And they're also little books of the heart too. They're novellas. And we was through Kindle Worlds that failed and I got my rights back. So I published them individually because Hawaiians were here in the Northwest. That's what I want people to know.
Mm, that's
That's in mischievous.
a
So,
wonderful range. A wonderful
yeah.
range.
So I'm all over the map.
But that's good because history is what unites it all, and love, probably. So I attended your research class at the Pulpwood Queens sponsored last month, and your website says you come from a family of pack rats, as do I.
Mhm.
I think people that love history save history. That's what I always say. Can you talk a little bit about the memorabilia that surrounds you, or that you change and have it there to inspire you? Because I know I've seen things like that in your office before.
Right. Well, what actually is my new office? What's behind me is actually a shawl that was worn by my great grandmother.
Oh,
Actually, my great great grandmother. So it'd be Jan Lynn, and from about the 1880s, I think. I could also belong to Frances Osborne, but
the
it's
peachy colored
this
drape.
here.
Mhm.
It's full of moth holes. I've taken good care of it. I've tried to, but it's no longer something that's functional. I thought, what the heck? I'll just throw it over this very ugly old file that I wanted to keep.
Very pretty.
I have other things upstairs, and actually I have, like, right in my back room, I have a beautiful sampler that was done by a great great grandmother, I think 1830. So she was probably about 8 to 9 years old learning how to do a sampler. I have that in my room. I keep it out of the light. And then I've got all kinds of stuff. I've got my grandmother's bacon fork, my Nana. And my mom remembers, growing up in Idaho. And of course, she was born in 1915. So it's before a lot of electricity. They had electricity in Boise, but, they had ice boxes, not Calvinators, which came later. So I have little things like that. I use the bacon fork now every Sunday. It's part of my ritual, making sourdough pancakes and bacon and little things like that. And I have actually incredible linens that they've done. I have my
Oh,
prize ones are little sewing kits. The oldest one is 1869 from Bongi, my great grandmother, my mom's grandmother. And I found out years later she had sewn her picture in there. A 19-year-old had sewn her picture into the needle case. So those kinds of things are surround me. I don't really write women's fiction, but the women are there. They're behind me, supporting me and saying, yes, do it.
yeah. I hear you. I hear you. So, um, do you enjoy writing series?
Well, I didn't think I was writing a series. I think I see them each as standalone. But
Yeah.
when I wrote Quizzling, I actually started on the Quizzing Factor not too long after, and then abandoned it. I actually had the ending. It was pretty well formed, but I went off with Tree Soldier, and then it's kind of a funny story. So Tree Soldier is 1935. It's set in the North Cascades. But a friend of mine who was the curator here in town, she had gotten this gag gift when she got married called What Every Young Wife Ought to Know. And it tells you absolutely nothing. It goes from, meeting your bow, laying out your linen, and then the next one is the layette. It's like, what happened? And then she said a couple of years later, she was rummaging around because she's like me. She likes to find things that are outrageous. And she found this thing that is a companion called What Every Young Husband Ought to Know. It's alarming because in her book, which was written by Dr. Drake, who was a physician, the second one is written by a reverend. But there's a chapter on don't rape your wife on the honeymoon. There's a whole chapter on abortion. And I think people today would be shocked. But
What year was that?
that published in 19. So first one is really about 19. I think it was 06. I have it as 1907 because the story starts. And I think that's actually when Young Husbands Ought to Know. And she said when she saw that, she threw across the room. She got so mad.
Well, of course.
We were having this conversation. I thought, well, maybe I should write about a couple in 1907. And what was that like? Because it's a new woman. It's a whole process. Women were getting jobs. They were going to college. And maybe they were delaying getting married. And then also that's the birth, 05 is the birth of the Forest Service. And I already was drawn into it because I wrote about the Civilian Conservation Corps. So that's how that one came about.
Okay, I get it now. So you write standalones, and if they fit with another book, people just can.
You can pick it up. In fact, I'm now working on, I'm going to finish the sequel, the prequel to Quisling, which is 2 years earlier.
Oh, okay.
There again, it's someplace I do not know anything about. I'm learning a lot. But I am planning on writing a sequel to Tree Soldier because I found out about women manning the fire towers in 1943. They were allowed to do it. And so I've already looked at all the characters from Timber Rose, from Tree Soldier, all the way up to 1943. Some of them will be in their 60s, but they've lived in this community. So I guess it will become a series. It's not something I planned, but I think readers also guide you too. They want to tell us more. Tell us more what happened. I actually have a sequel to Quisling, and I planned it'll be 1948. Many of the people I interviewed were all immigrants who came here from Norway, usually starting about 1949 into the early 50s. They were on rations till 1955 in Norway. And so conditions are very hard. If you had a relative here, you would be able to come over and immigrate over here and get settled. A lot of people chose Washington State. It looks so much like Norway. There's places here you could be in Norway. So they felt very at home with the seas and with the loggings in the mountains. So
I found people do that when they immigrate. They look for someplace that is as much like home as they can find. So did you have any surprises when you wrote these two books?
Well, the funny thing about them is I didn't expect to be writing about a dead man. That's one of the things I wrote down, because in the very beginning, I have Einar Fromm, and he's Anna Fromm's in Quisling, that's her husband, and she's accused of betraying him. She didn't know he was in New York in this military organization. But when I was writing, it was like tap, tap, tap. It's time to talk about me. And something horrible happened to him in Brennan's cloister. And it's like tap, tap, tap. You need to talk about me. So, and he's actually in the Quisling factory in spirit, because I became a widow very unexpectedly 20 years ago. And that kind of reformed how I started writing Anna years before. So that was a change. I felt like she should be crying more. She should be angry, because anger is part of grief, and especially when it's sudden. And she doesn't know, she's never going to see his body because it was destroyed, sent out to sea in a box, which Brennan did. But, so she carries this, and you carry grief with you. Well, I've carried grief for 20 years. It's different, but it's hard the first couple of years. I have one friend just recently lost her husband, and all the stuff she's going through. So I put that into Anna. And I even thought her decision to, spoiler alert, to, go with the man who ends up protecting her, this guy pretending to be a deaf mute. She falls in love with him because he's kind. He's just communicating with a notebook. She finally learns how to sign a little bit, but she is so lonely, and he's lonely too. And so that formed also the story too. I think the other thing I was surprised was I had to really explore deaf culture in Norway. And I'm working on this new prequel set in Bergen. So I started looking around about that. I have spy maps that have guided me all these years from British Naval Intelligence. They're up at my library, the university up the hill from me. And when I pulled those off the shelf, I went, oh my God, the maps are showing you all the important structures you need to know blow up, but it has detailed accounts. Like, when you got on the train in such and such a place, they have buffet. You can get something to eat there. It's all laid out for all the agents.
Wow.
So I started looking around for, Bergen, because that's a new place. And lo and behold, I discovered a teacher of the deaf. And one of the historians there sent me, well, here's something about him. It was in a deaf magazine, and it was talking about him. And we're so sorry he passed away. I knew he died. In fact, I knew he was killed by the Gestapo. And it's this thing in their national newspaper, which the Germans allowed them to publish. But it's like, oh, we just love him. He worked with the boys. And then I found out after the war what happened. He was in Milorg. He was a courier. So boom, now I have my character, because he is a deaf uncle. He has always had a compassion for people with hearing loss. And it was really cute because I was trying to get in touch with people in Bergen. And this guy from the association there, he said, you're writing about deaf culture. No one ever writes about deaf culture in Norway.
Yeah, it's a wonderful slant to the whole story. And it brings the reader in to empathize so much more with the characters, at least this reader.
Yeah.
So, brilliant done. And it's interesting that it wasn't there from the very beginning to me as a
Right.
writer.
Yeah, I think the other thing is Televogue, which is the story in both pieces. And I just had someone from the Pacific Northwest Writers write a review for Quisling, and he was going on about, not knowing this story about Televogue. And I've become kind of strong enough to talk about it that I can go on World War II TV, which was the scariest thing I think I've ever done, because they have incredible international historians there. But I did a talk on that. But that is a story that I feel like I am becoming a champion for, because Norwegian Americans did not know about this. And it was this they call it the Ladies of the North. And it actually happened about 5 weeks before the Ladies that happened in Poland, where they wiped out a village. So that's the story that runs through it. And I've learned so much more since then.
Another book.
Well, it's another book. It's in the story, and I've been communicating with the curator, Televogue. He's helping me with many things. And it turns out it's an important drop-off place for the Shetland Islands. And I've always known that 1942 was the year they did they call it the roll-ups in Norway. It's happening all across Europe. The Gestapo is getting very tough. And this was a Shetland bus drop-off place. And I've now realized that Televogue is the starting point where everything was unraveled, from the arrest of an agent and 2 German Gestapos who were killed. And it unraveled the entire system in Norway. It took them about a year to recover. So it is an important event, but a lot of people don't know about it.
You mentioned what a Quisling is. And we've talked a little bit about the history of World War II in Norway. Is there anything else you'd like to say about that?
Well, Quisling was actually a politician, and they didn't know that he'd actually gone to talk to Hitler probably about a few days before. But this is the complication when you talk about Quisling and the aftermath of the war. The interesting thing that he had done a lot with refugees after World War I. He dealt with Russian refugees after World War I, and he was considered kind of a hero in the 20s. But he turned in the 30s into the National Samling, as their Nazified party there, very, Norway for us only kind of thing. And he just sort of let the Germans come in, and he didn't really let them come in, but he jumped on the radio that night saying, I'm taking over, I'm the new head of the government. And they finally, Germans appointed him. So that is what Quisling means. It means traitor. Jostling actually means patriot. It's a word used. So I have the Patriot Affair, essentially, in that novel. But I think to know that I think one of the most startling things I have learned over the years, that at one point they had 400,000 German soldiers in Norway. This is a population of 3 million in 1940. That's the size of Berlin. And so they have this massive amount of people there. After the fall of Stalingrad, the big fight, and where the Germans took many, many Russian POWs, they were sent to Norway as slaves. So they're working on the U-boat pens in Bergen. They're building this road that goes north of Trondheim. And one of the first people I interviewed remembers a man who lived in a hole. He was a Russian POW, and this guy lived around Bergen, south of there. and he was in a hole with a tin roof, and he felt so badly for this person. So that's something, this huge numbers, when you're liberated, what do you do with 250,000 people still? I think they still were up to 350,000 at the end of the war. How do you get people, these German soldiers, to lay down their arms and go back to Germany, which is now in pieces? And so that's the mess. And after World War II, the countries were a mess because you had people that were picked up here and they're sent to work in someplace else, and their family villages destroyed wherever they came from. It's a mess. And so Norway was a mess. And that's one of the things I think you should know, that many German soldiers were in Norway. They also did not surrender on the same day. They surrendered on May 8th. And if it hadn't been for Eisenhower and many other people urging the Germans to surrender, they could have gone on another 6 months. And the Allies were extremely worried that this is what would happen, is that they would have to go back to Norway and fight these 350,000 soldiers who are rested. They are not fighting on the front. So they did get them to surrender. And I think the last group of Germans left, I think in August of 45, there may have still been some left, even as late as the following year in 46. You have to process all these people, make sure they're not in the Gestapo, make sure they weren't guilty of these crimes, that they had true war crimes there.
I think that the healing doesn't ever end because it just keeps going. Because I'm thinking about all the people that stayed and the people that didn't, and they weren't all from Norway. So I think we can push things away, suppress them a little bit, but that's not necessarily what we should actually be doing. And that's why books like yours are so wonderful, because they let us examine it. They let us re-examine history from a more objective place, perhaps.
Right. You know, when you look back, you say, well, why did they make that decision, or why did they make that decision? I have two friends. One's now 91. The other one's 97. She's from Bergen. And the other one, she is from, I call her my Tante Ellen. She's so lovely. And she helped me go to Norway. She said, you're going. So that's how I was able to do my research for Quisling.
Wonderful.
But she was just 11 when they invaded, and she had a gun put to her head by German soldiers. And she was left alone on a cow, milking on the cows. They took away the farm. They arrested the owners because they were in the resistance. And she's told me a lot of stories too, what it was like for her. She was from Oslo. Like, she was late to school one day because her roommate or her friend was always late. And so they were late getting to the bus. They missed their trolley, and a block away, it got hit by an Allied raid on Oslo. Everybody died. She could have been on that trolley. So, stories like that adds to the human element of how dangerous. And how do you make a decision? One of the best ones I have seen talking about that is called The French Village. And I think it's now on Prime Video. It was on HMZ. I watched the whole thing.
I'll have to look for it.
It's excellent because it shows from the very beginning the Germans hit this little French village. The decisions that people make is fascinating to watch. I wonder about the actors who played them, because the characters doing what, they always have French historians on at the end. Many of them were children when this happened. It's a wonderful, wonderful series. And they're starting to do
a couple of people that were in the resistance, one in France and one in Belgium. And they were both incredibly young. One was a child and the other one was right out of high school.
Yeah, everybody in the resistance in Norway, the leader of Ramsperger, who was the leader of the heavy water raid, he was 21. And he's fascinating. This is where I got this idea of what happened to them. He became the head of public television in Norway.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, like 1948. I mean, I don't think we had TV in the US,
Yeah.
Person. Amazing.
I don't think we did. So I want to move on. I want to make sure I include this quote about intelligence work, because it reminded me of my own humanitarian work, and I just love the way you put it. No one could understand the tension unless you experienced it. It could be very boring, but also very dangerous. You had to have steady nerves all the time. So do you think that it's gotten better or worse? That boredom and then action, and then boredom and then action, in terms of your research? Did you find out whether this was time specific, or I have a feeling it's gotten worse.
I think it's gotten worse because of technology. I mean, I think it'd be very dangerous being resisting against something, because the technology of bugging you,
Mhm.
videos,
You
satellites,
always know where you are.
all that stuff. Know where you are. Back then, though, they had DRTs, is what the Germans used to go around the neighborhood. They eventually became portable, so you try to catch those radio signals that were going to England and sending information back and forth. But his quote about, he's explaining to some friends what it was like, is it was boring and you had to be so careful. He has to be careful all the time. Only one person knows who he really is, and he has to be careful not to jump when he hears a sound. He just has to. And one of the
How do you
most,
do that
I don't know
in a
how, but I did.
war?
I actually later have read about accounts. I knew about accounts of people pretending to be disabled and stuff like that, who were actually resistance. But I found more stuff about deaf culture later on. But one person I really admire, his name is Thompson, I think his last name. I'm going to mess his name up, but I read his memoir and he's amazing. He posed right off the bat as a Quisling. He decided this is what he's going to do. He kept a radio way up. It's this tiny little village at the top of a little fjord, and he had a hut up there with his radio. But he hung out with people. He hung out with Germans. He even watched a friend tortured. But after the war, I started looking at his bio. He died really young. He died in about 1954. And he was already in his late 20s when the war started. And I thought, wow, he died really young. There is a statue dedicated to him in Oakley, which is north of Bergen. And he's very highly thought of. He always had to carry a letter from King Håkon saying that he was a Quisling, he was a patriot. And his own mother didn't know. One time he came very close to killing himself with a pill because they were outside his door. He got pneumonia like my character did, and he finally trusted this one girl. He was so lonely. He did this for 5 years. And the mental capacity to put on this face, especially when you have friends being tortured, people you know personally, and have to be, oh, isn't this fun? Kind of an attitude. He did trust this one girl. He ended up marrying her, which is a nice story.
Yeah.
But she hid him when he got pneumonia, and she finally told her father. She said, I'm hiding this guy in the barn. He's very, very sick, and we need to take care of him. And he did. They both survived the war. They had children, but he did die young. And I thought that struck me right off the bat. Like, well, what's going on here? What is the toll of being in intelligence today? It's so, the technology, I think, could be done from your phone. But it was different back then. So I
very different, very different. I also appreciated the way you described the people's tragic choices, which you just talked about. And the one that really brought it home to me were the sports heroes. These were not characters. You just mentioned that the sports heroes were shot if they didn't play for the Nazis. What a choice would that be? I just can't even imagine, although it's still going on right now. I'm thinking about a country right now.
Right now. Yeah, and it's interesting, like in Ukraine, they're highlighting, I think, other top tennis players now guarding Kyiv. Yeah, so that was interesting. So the invasion happened April 9th, 1940.
Which is coming up.
Yeah. And on June 5th is when France fell. The Allies were supporting way in the north, supporting everybody up in the far north of Norway, but they left. So Norway was completely on its own. Joseph de Bourbon was a close personal friend of Hitler, and he is sent to be overseer of the whole operation in Norway. And, they have all they've, in a single day, they occupied Bergen, Oslo, Trondheim, all the way up the coast. It's astonishing how they just all arrived. One person I interviewed said he went down to work and there were these guys standing around and he read the paper. He said, we're invaded. That's what he found out. And then he found out his boss was a Nazi. He's the only person I interviewed from Trondheim. But, and I've met others since then. But so, yeah, the choices you make are really dire. You can make mistakes. So we had members of the sports team, of course, ski jumping. I mean, the Olympics had only been, I think Olympics were 38. So, Norwegians in the Winter Olympics, of course, they all did really well. And so the ski jumping teams and stuff like that, they were trying to Nazify all the sports club. And they just refused. So some of them were shot for refusing to do that. Some of them just disappeared. They melded into different organizations or just refused, and you can be arrested for refusing.
Right.
They took over the theaters and everything. You couldn't watch anything that was Allied, so anything English, American, whatever, especially a Jewish author. All these books were banned by Jewish authors, but American authors, like Hemingway, there were a whole series called, I can't remember now, I knew it from long ago for Quisling, but they had a whole series of books published in Norwegian of all our great authors. And a lot of them, had only been published in the 30s, our great ones. And actually what's really interesting, The Moon is Down. I don't know if you know that story.
I do.
Yeah, so that's John Steinbeck. That was smuggled into Norway as a mimeograph. And it was illegal to read it. And, they never mentioned it's Norway in the story, but it's Norway in the story. It became first book, then a play, then a movie. And it was smuggled in there. And after the war, I've seen pictures of him where he was honored with a Norwegian flag by him because they felt he was finally getting the story out. So that was illegal. Definitely not going to read anything by Steinbeck,
East of Eden is my favorite novel of all time. Yeah. His East of Eden. And I think I've read everything he's ever written because of his ability to evoke that I haven't ever found again in any other author. He really was amazing that way.
Yeah, my husband loved him.
So can you talk a little bit about the mini furnaces people had on their backs? Were those there before and they just made more use of them because it was so cold, or did they invent them as a result of the war? Do you know?
Around a little bit, but so what happened is that they're called not generator. So I finally learned the word for it, but I saw a picture in a National Geographic. So interestingly, magazines like Time Magazine, Newsweek, National Geographic, they were talking about Norway. And so when I started writing these books, like, why doesn't anybody know about this history? It's all about France or something. Why did I not know this history? So I saw this funky looking thing. It's like this big cylinder that fits on the back of your car. And and they had them on buses too. So gasoline was rationed. Actually, I think it's Shell Oil in Oslo had a secret stockpile for the resistance. But you had to carry this face that you're working with the Germans, and some people were guilty of working with the Germans. But it's this tightrope you follow. But anyway, so. They don't have a lot of cars anyway in Norway, but they had a lot of American models, which I found was fascinating. And so when the rationing happened, they just put the not generator on the back. And so Ella has one. She has one of the few cars. The doctor in Felstad has a car. And so finally I asked a question many years ago, how long would it take to go from my imaginary Felstad to Trondheim? And they said, it'll be an hour and a half. I had to go back and totally change that. I had it wrong. I was got a long ride over the mountains to Trondheim. And you went to the gas station. I interviewed someone. I said, yeah, you go to the gas station and you pick up a paper bag of the charcoal, or I think even wood chips, really dried wood chips would work as well. And you stuck the bag in the back and you lit it. and then off you'd go. And you could get up to almost 50 miles an hour, which is pretty speedy back then, you know. And then one of the funny stories I ever heard about one of the guys in Linka Company, which is this famous group out of Oslo, if you saw a German soldier on the road, you're supposed to pick him up. So this German got in with this resistance guy. In the back, he has a whole bunch of stolen ration cards that they are giving out to. It's all covered in the back. And the German soldiers just, yeah, thanks for the ride. And the guy does speak German. And he's complimenting him on his, you guys are so inventive. I love these furnaces on the back of your car. He didn't realize that they would put a motor in there that produced heat. And they would always check you, a checkpoint. They put their hands on the furnace to make sure it was warm. It was running on gasoline, and it was going up the hill just fine. So gasoline. I think it's one of my favorite stories. So.
That's a wonderful story. Thank you.
No clue.
So as long as we're on wonderful stories, this is my random question because it made me wonder. I wondered if you had the family take refuge in the Folklife Museum for symbolism, like comparing the life before to life now, or was it that you had visited there and you really just thought it would be the perfect thing to put in your novel?
That's sort of it. So after I spent 13 days in Trondheim, I ended up with a homestay, which was unexpected. They took me everywhere. And then I got on a train to Oslo, and I was going to eventually go to Drammen to see a high school friend. But anyway, I went to the Viking Museum. If you get an Oslo pass, you can do every piece of museum and transportation. So you take a little ferry over to Viking. And on the way, I went like, wait a minute, that's the Folklife Museum. You're actually in a residential neighborhood for these things. And I knew it had a stop church. So a stop church is all wood. They're very dramatic. They kind of go up high, and they have spouts with dragons on it. And some of those ones are from about, I think, 1090. There are a few that are still there, but this one was a small one. And I just was so struck with it, and it's dark in there. So I decided, because I also looked, the island that they are on, further down with my spy map, they post in the east, it's in two parts for Oslo, but on the east side, or the west side thing, they show that there is a seaplane outfit there. So I looked up the history of that airfield, and yep, they would still be doing it in 1946. And I thought, well, it's so close. They'll go there, they'll get on the seaplane and get out of there without anybody noticing them. So that's why, but you know, it does have a symbolic, the Viking spirit. The museum was allowed to stay open during the war, during the occupation. You know, a lot of German soldiers went there because they were really into the Viking. They almost took the Viking ships. That's a true story. They tried to a couple of times. And it was actually the Norwegian Nazis that stopped them. So you can't take that. They were going to move those ships to
Well,
Germany.
I'm glad.
Right. They would have been destroyed in the bombing.
See, that's the kind of thing that I love talking about in terms of research, because how would anybody have known the depth of research that you had to do to make sure it would work? And it did.
It did.
And it works well as a symbol too, because when I read that, and it's just a mention, right? It's not, you don't go on and on about it. I thought about all the light we cannot see. So it really did serve to be quite symbolic for my particular read. So I appreciated it a lot. So going to get to the definition of hero. And to do that, I'm going to read something from your wonderful novel that I think actually is a huge theme throughout it about who is a hero and who isn't. Who will ask years from now, what did you do during the occupation? Not everyone is a hero. And do you think Haugland is a hero? And what would you say a hero is in this context?
Well, I think the way I talk about novels, that they're about people standing up for something in their own time and place. I mean, you could say that with Jeannie Naughton in Mischievous in 1860. She's standing up for the treatment of Hawaiians, Kanakas who lived on San Juan Island. Also, she gets to know, her whole attitude changes as an English woman. And the same way with people in war situations, you know, in Timber Rose, it's standing up to the groups that want to destroy the forests versus the people, the beginning of the conservation movement, you know, conserving the wilderness. That was a big thing here and in my county to preserve Mount Baker. So you're standing up for something based on all the, I've read a lot of memoirs, and since then I've read many more. I would say most people, both men and women, you're hearing more about the women in the resistance, which is a good thing. But more of them never felt they were heroes. They were doing desperate things in order to, you know, get the Germans heck out of their country. And it was extremely dangerous. The Gestapo, like Renan actually worked what he called a negative agent. He would entice people into thinking that he was a US thing. And sometimes they would have cigarettes, or they'd have recordings of King Håkon, who was a symbol. He was, you know, he's exiled in England, but he was a great symbol. And he would entice people in. One of the most famous ones in Trondheim is Randy Rue. She was like 20 or 19 years old, and she thought she was working for a patriotic organization. And in fact, she was working for Renan. He had about, I don't know, several hundreds of people that believe this. And so anyway, back to Hero, they didn't think they were just doing what they could do. And it's so confusing. One people have to understand it's so sparsely populated. One of the guys interviewed, he was in one village and had like a spit that went around to the other side, little tiny little fjord. His village had the telephone. The other village where his girlfriend was, later married her, they had something else that they didn't have. And so, he said, sometimes you actually spoke a different dialect. So it's very difficult trying to get information. If someone comes in there and saying, you know, hey, you know, that's what happened in Televogue. Someone came in posing as, I think came in as a Bible salesman in 1942. And he found out just from people chatting, oh yeah, we got some British guys that are hanging out at this house. And it's just simple like that, because they're trusting. And Norwegians are pretty trusting, you know, so that that's the crux of it, I think. But you're standing up for something, and Hagen does not think of himself as a hero. He's traumatized a lot by what happened to the village that hit him. He feels so guilty. And many people, you know, I've read recent articles, and when I was in Trondheim, I talked to people both at the Resistance Museum and the Justice Museum to learn about the trial. And they said many people were traumatized. One person who testified against Renan, Renan's sitting right there with all 29 other people that are part of his group, including 7 women. And he said the guy just about broke down. Now, my guy that I talked to was a retired Trondheim police officer. And he said that he saw this, he interviewed people many years later in their lives, but he said he saw the same thing when you had a domestic violence person testifying, or someone, maybe a serious break-in. All I saw when I was there was people knocking off geraniums off front porches. They don't have a lot of crime in Trondheim. But he said, you know, he said that he understood this trauma because, and so the son that he interviewed of one of the main people who testified, and he was in the cloister, he was tortured. He kept breaking down. And I actually changed that scene with Hagen. I thought, you know, I need to really get into him. He's doing something that's important. It's so traumatic. You know,
and he has to wait the whole novel almost to testify. And that just built the tension and built the tension and built the tension, because I could almost feel his dread of it.
The nightmare of being with it. And you know, it's really fun, the very end. I'll give that away, but maybe not. But anyway, I have a friend of mine, we both sing in the Watkin Chorale. She's Norwegian. So she's helped me with a lot of Norwegian words, but she was able to, I isolated the verdict from the trial in Norwegian on radio. So I sent her the clip and she told me what it was. So actually it's authentic. And how you react to that, we have people that have lost people to violence in our culture. And it's never resolved. The trial doesn't really resolve anything.
No.
But maybe it's a little, if there's some justice, there is some justice. So, but he did get his just reward. I have to say that. But Brendan was horrible. And that, in the first novel, to put my character, I decided when I was writing that was all the Rambo movies where people are being tortured, beaten, and they just jump up. And I'm reading 1953 memoirs of people in the Norwegian resistance. No, it's not how it is. You have
It's
physical.
not how it is.
No, you have
I
physical.
think that does a disservice to young people.
It does.
Showing it like that.
I know it's not. It's not. And there's physical damage and there is psychological damage that you have to deal with. One of my friends who does Norwegian, he does German albums. And I met him online 22 years ago. And he does German photographs from German soldiers in Norway. They're the most mind-boggling pictures you ever saw. And he said one year, I asked him how he got into this because we met finally in Trondheim. And he said, yeah, he used to go up to his grandfather's cabin way up north when he was a kid. And he said one night his grandfather, something happened outside. His grandfather fell on the floor of the hut, screaming. And he was like 10. He's going, what is going on? Well, it turns out his grandfather's remembering something the Germans did. So it trauma never goes away. It's how you,
It comes
like
in your dreams.
experience. So you talk to someone, possibly, and of course, men are notorious for not wanting to talk about it because we see the trauma in our own vets that come back from wars. And I'm thinking of Ukraine right now, the trauma they're going through.
Yeah.
It's generational.
My dad was World War II in Italy. He was very young, and so he really only saw a tiny bit of the war, but he was there for Reconstruction. And I remember before he died, I was so interested in the war, and I said, "Did you ever see a dead body?" And he just kind of smirked and goes, "Oh yeah." So we weren't allowed to touch him when he was asleep. He would jump up and be ready to fight. So
that's exactly it.
Yeah. So winding down, I want to make sure we have enough time for you to tell us where to find you and what's next. But I really want to make sure this one is in there. Do you think history repeats itself? I have the belief that the past informs the present. I believe history isn't necessarily linear. And I wonder if you agree or disagree, or how so, and how does writing about this shadow side of the human experience in history shine a light on man?
Well, I have to say that writing it was difficult. It was hard enough writing about what happened to him in the first novel. I mean, that was the last thing I wrote. My kids and my husband took the boys fishing, and I was depressed. And I finally sat down and wrote it. And then the next day I was okay. But one friend was worried about me, but I was depressed. So writing about this thing, the aftermath of trauma, that was hard. I'm so glad that people are liking the novel because it was really emotionally hard to write, to put everybody through that. But I don't know. I like what Mark Twain says, that history rhymes. It's not necessarily. But, right now, the bunch of us that write World War II history, we're a little nervous because there are signs, we have our own problems here in this country, far right, white nationalists, and that's concerning. In fact, some people are very concerned about it. It's like an echo, and, you should have known better. And I always tell people history hurts. You have to let it out. You have to discuss it. And not say it's fake news. It happened, and that's the peril You need to understand history. And there's so many organizations that are blocking it, not even being allowed to talk about slavery. Slavery is part of our national heritage, and you have to talk about it and what it means to
Yeah.
those who were enslaved and to those who were the enslavers. And you have to accept it. You may not have been there, but you have to understand that it's trauma that is the thing that leads us down this way. I'm sure, like in Ukraine, they are reliving the trauma.
Another echo.
Yeah.
I feel like if we don't discuss the history, there's no way to get healing. Because it's been swept under the rug in a different way since the 60s, maybe before that. That's when I came into the world. And now it's actually being denied and negated, and the books are being banned. So I totally agree. And I'm so glad you're writing history, because you're the one to do it. The research is, you blow me away with your research.
It's
So
kind
thank
of
you.
fun, I mean,
Oh.
like, yeah, it's fun, and now that, like you said, writing a series, I guess I am, because I care about my characters, and I know my readers care about my characters. So that's why I'm continuing to write, about Norway. And I've been really blessed by people of Norwegian descent, that first it was like, oh, you're not Norwegian. And one friend said, you should be writing this because it's hard, or we don't know about it, or we're not, we know about it, but we don't know a lot, because our parents, frankly, didn't talk about it. That was interesting. In Trondheim, my hostess took me to her swimming class. So just like every other 67-year-old in the pool with a 20-year-old running up and down the side of the pool, this is cracking me up. Afterwards, they met me, in their little cafe at the club. And these women said, our parents never talked about this. And they leaned in. What do you know? That was.
That gave me chills.
Yeah,
That you were the one that they were asking. That's amazing.
It is amazing. So I tell people it's a privilege, and it's a sacred privilege.
Yeah.
Because again, all the people I interviewed and keep sharing me their incredible stories, I feel like, it's an honor, and I'll probably keep writing about it. I have, at least once I get this prequel done, I will have, I'll start possibly working on the next one.
Well, you have a fan in me. I'm interested to read your Northwest books too. But I love any kind of European history. So I just ate this one off. Thank you for it. So one question about writing for the writers who are going to be listening. You mentioned that you were depressed and your husband took your kids out fishing. Yes, did I get that right? And you started writing, and then you weren't depressed. And I've heard a lot of writers, myself included, who, if they really need to write, they have some kind of anxiety or sadness. And once it needs to be released, right? So do you have a schedule, or do you sort of know from your body language, that you really need to write this and you need to do it now, and you go do it?
Well, I used to go to Starbucks, and actually with Quisling, so I started researching that 28 years ago. I was standing in bank lines, writing on back of envelopes. I have the envelopes, because the story's just coming at me. But for many years, I used to go to Starbucks, which was downtown, no longer there. And then I went to another one, and of course, COVID just shut everything down. I would say that my wonderful baristas knew I was always writing. I even dedicated it to them, I think, in Tree Soldier.
Aww.
They were wonderful, and they were so encouraging. So now, for the last couple of years, it's almost 2 years now, I joined a group. It's out of Surrey Writers in Canada. It's called the Creative Academy for Writers, or something like that. And I get up at 7 a.m. It's killing me because of daylight savings time. But I get up in the morning, and at 7 o'clock, 7:30, I am on Zoom with this group writing. We write for a whole hour, and then we talk at the end. And they can do it all day. They have different groups. There's a group in Europe that's meeting, Yeah, they're meeting at 3 a.m. Sorry, I'm not going to get up for that one. But so that has become the discipline. I would say for anyone who's starting out, you need to have the habit. And some people write at night. Some people get stuff, when the kids are away at school. I started writing when my kids were still, the youngest one was still in elementary school. In fact, when I was done with it, he said, "Mom, will you play with me?" And I'm thinking, no, I'm starting Tree Soldiers. So terrible mom. But it's
That's
discipline.
not being a terrible mom. It's
Yeah.
doing what keeps you happy, and that keeps the kids happy. And I've got a story that's kind of similar. My son, when he was in kindergarten, you know how they had star of the day?
Mhm.
He said, what's your dad's hobby? And I probably said sports of some sort. And what's your mom's hobby? She plays computer games all day.
Oh, that's great.
Because
Mom.
when I was writing, he thought I was it is like play, right? It is. It's a game. Kept me sane all through their young childhood. So any advice for writers, especially second career writers, third career writers, that you've learned over the years?
Well, I think number one, you should follow your passion. So my passion is history, and I'm always intrigued. I'm curious. So I see a fact like smuggling quinoline in your crinoline, quinine and crinoline was the smuggling thing during the Civil War. I had to have it in a novel. So you get curious. Well, the non-generator, I had to have that in that thing. There's just so intriguing. People running around on wood burning furnaces, during the war. So I think you follow your passion. And if your passion is sci-fi, fantasy, or romance, go with it. Don't worry about the market. You're not there yet. You need to write and do that. And then you need to, if you're writing, and even if you're writing a memoir, you do have to do some kind of research, because you need to know external stuff that's happening around your story. Like I wrote an essay, it's called The Christmas Well, and it's about the night I went out to get water. The well was a 1940s water tank that was brought to our neighborhood in Pittsburgh because our pipes all froze. And it's a very lyrical story. I love it. But I remember a couple of things. I remember going up to get the water Christmas Eve, and it started to snow. So it's this magical time. And I remember all the pots of water in the kitchen. And to me, that's how we gathered water, because we had no water. My mom says there was a leak. So that's a funny thing. I don't think it'd been a leak because it's frozen, unless a pipe froze down the basement. But the water, the whole neighborhood had frozen pipes. And I remember the streams of the ice going out like banyan roots. That's one thing I remember from that, just looking down at it. So we were without water. But I had to look up stuff about the 1950s, what was going on that year too as well. So you have to do a little bit of research too, whatever you're writing. Even sci-fi, you're creating a world. Essentially, when you write historical fiction, you are creating a world. Absolutely. But the world has to have facts around it. You just can't put something here.
You can't write a book unless you ground the reader in it. You have to. Yeah, it has to seem real, even if it isn't.
Yeah.
So before I ask you where, I have to share this one because I always share it. And it is, even a journey of 1,000 miles starts with a first step.
Oh yeah. So. That's right. You do your tea bags. Is it a black tea?
It's yogi tea. It's herbal tea. This one is, I just pull them. I have several boxes.
I have to go look for those.
This one's honey lavender. And yeah, so what is next? I guess your prequel, right? And do you have a title? Do you have a working title?
I'm calling it the Quizzling Code.
Oh.
And I already had a title for the sequel, the Quisling, will be Quisling Factor. It's called the Jaeger War. Jaeger means hunter. And it'd be 1948. But I decided, readers are asking. So I thought, well, I'll just go back a couple of lines in Quisling. I said, okay, I'll go back there, even though I don't know a lot. And then I've written a good portion of this novel during the Civil War set up here in the Pacific Northwest. It starts at the Battle of Gettysburg because my great grandfather was the assistant surgeon for the 11th PA. I grew up on his journals. So I'm taking, and in a way, it is a story about PTSD, which they called soldier's heart. They didn't start calling that until about 1870 something, but this idea that the trauma, and he saw so much trauma. He was a country doctor he was only in the Army 2 months, and he was at Gettysburg, which was a madhouse. And we went for the 150th. So I have a good portion of that. I have them stuck out in Fort Vancouver in 1964. Lincoln is losing the election, and there's a lot of intrigue going on here in the Northwest. So I may go to that one, but now I'm intrigued with the women who were permitted to run the fire towers in 1943. If you were the wife of a vet, or if you had someone in the Forest Service. So that's Kate Hardesty in Tree Soldier. She's already done it, and I've been researching that. So I may choose that as the next one, because I know a lot about the home front in the US, especially in my neck of woods, because we did a whole show. I was a museum educator for 11 years. And one of the shows we did was World War II in Skagit. We even had Band of Brothers. I think Bud is his name. He lives in Skagit. He's gone now, but he's a very famous character in Band of Brothers. And he came and gave a talk. But what I worked on was the home front, because I did all the education for children. And I learned all about the V home and all this stuff. So that'll be fun.
It shows in your writing. It shows that our careers follow us. There's a reason that we have the career we did, because my humanitarian career shows in my writing. So they all sound absolutely fascinating. I can't wait for all of them. It seems like you have such rich primary source material with the Gettysburg story.
Oh, I did. They've been interviewing us. He kept really good journals, and I typed them all up about 25 years ago. They're with my brother. I think we're going to give it to the Gettysburg. They have a national park is supported by the Gettysburg Friends, and I think it'd be safe there. There's Gettysburg College there. But yeah, again, it goes back to those family stories, and sometimes you can get someone who's starting out writing. It may be a story that you heard. And it may be just, now the 60s is now considered historical fiction. So you're seeing a lot more of that. Makes me really creaky, but that's how it is. Funny thing, a long time ago, I wanted to write about Niels, who is the baby in Quisling as a Vietnam vet in Hawaii.
Wow. Wouldn't that be interesting?
Yeah, because also questioning his father. I realized as through I got into XU. XU is this secret intelligence agency that Hagen belongs to. And I took it out of the trial scene when I was finalizing the manuscript, because no one knew about XU. They weren't allowed to talk about it for 40 years. So that would be a fun thing to throw Hagen's son and him.
Mm-hmm.
What'd you do during the war, Dad? No, I'm not going to talk about it. Why is your hand funny? Well, I had a fishing accident. That kind of thing.
What happened? It's what happened.
It might be really fun to do that. I don't know if I'll ever get around to it. I don't know what to call it. I thought to get lost in Haleakala, which I crossed a couple of times as a young woman with my husband. But anyway, that's out there.
Well, I am waiting expectantly for the next one. And your website is jloakleyauthor.com. And I'm assuming people can find your books on many different online retailers. Is there a special place you'd like to send them?
Well, if they want to buy a book, go to indie bookstore, My Village Books, ask them to order it. But also, ask your librarian to order it for your library.
Yeah.
But Amazon is one place. I have them on Ingram Spark. And I'm really excited about this one email that I got the other day is they're going to recommend Quizzling for the Pacific Northwest Writers Booksellers catalog. And I'm blown away. I'm in the.
Oh boy, that's fantastic.
I know. So
that's such fantastic news for all indie writers, and I'm a small press writer. I'm traditional, but it's still small press. And to be in a catalog is a big deal. Congratulations. And it shows that indie writers are getting noticed, which they well deserve to be noticed.
Right. It's a slog, it's hard work, but I think I don't want, I mean, sometimes I say, oh, this book is so great, you know, there's literally 1,000 reviews, you know, but I plug along, but I get reviews, people contact me who are Norwegians, said, I appreciate this so much. And then they tell me the story. Like, my parents were married at the Deaf Church in Oslo. I said, do you realize that Comrade Bonnie Svensson married them? You know, he was baptized at the Deaf Church in Oslo. I mean, these little funny stories that come up. But yes, so that's where you can find me. I'm also at JL Oakley, on Twitter. I'm on Twitter a lot. And Instagram, I'm there too as well. So I'm learning other platforms. So.
Well, thank you for sharing all of these tidbits of history. So thank you. And thank you everybody for watching. And you can join me here live every third Thursday, at least that's my hope, at my Facebook page, Interviewing Authors. You can find all my interviews archived. You can find more about me at shoresofoursouls.com. And for now, I'm looking forward to seeing you all again. You can tell that, and there is the Quisling factor. You can tell that I wore my green even though we're talking about Norway. And until then, this is Kathy Ramsperger bidding you a nice walk and hopefully beautiful weather and a good weekend with a great book to read, like Janet's books. Thank you so much. Bye for now, everyone.
Bye-bye.